Hello, my name is Colby Seiden, and today I will be talking about pesticides in agriculture and their impacts on society and the environment. So, why should you care about pesticides? Well, you eat food, right? Specifically fruits, vegetables, and grains. Everyone needs food. There's actually a very high demand for food all around the world, and pesticides play a large role in our global food supply. They actually increase our global food production by over 40%. Farmers use pesticides to eliminate agricultural pests and to preserve and protect their crops, which we use for food. These crops are a major source of our food supply as they supply many vegetables, fruits, and wheats, and they're a large part of humans' regulatory diets. And if you still don't think that pesticides impact you, I'm here to tell you that they actually have a great economic impact on our society. Canada's annual fruit harvest value increases by over $353 million each year due to the use of pesticides. Pesticides also keep our food affordable as more crops are able to be grown on a larger variety of land. One more thing that many people don't know about pesticides is that they actually eliminate bacteria that can cause foodborne diseases. Well, now you must be thinking, wow, pesticides, these are really great. Why don't we produce more of them? Well, there are many negative impacts of pesticides as well. Over 1,000 pesticides are used in foods globally, right? You might think it's a good thing. Although 200,000 people die from pesticide exposure yearly due to these food poisonings. There's actually a large variety of health issues that can result from pesticide exposure. Some of these include cancer, seizures, respiratory issues like asthma, infertility issues, and also nausea. Pesticides are also harmful to many animals and wildlife around the world. For example, 40% of insects face extinction due to the use of pesticides. There are also many more organisms that are affected, but they will be discussed later in the presentation. Now that you know both sides, what do you think? Are pesticides good? Are they bad for society? Let's discuss this in our presentation and come back to that question at the end. Okay, now it's time to discuss today's agenda. What will we be discussing today? First, we're going to be talking about how to classify pesticides based on their type, origin, and chemical structures. Secondly, we'll be talking about pesticides' impacts on society and the environment. After that, we will be discussing the use of pesticides globally, and finally, we will conclude the presentation by revisiting some of the pros and cons and concluding thoughts about pesticides. Let's begin with a general description of what pesticides actually are. So, a pesticide is a general term for a substance that kills pests or reduces the impact or damage that pests may cause. There are various types of pesticides with many different functions and characteristics. Where might pesticides be used? Well, most pesticides are used in farms, homes, parks, and gardens around the world. Many pesticides are available for purchase at local stores and online for anyone that really wants to use them. When were pesticides discovered? Well, pesticides were first used in the early 1900s, but have really been developed and refined for various uses since then. Why are pesticides used? Well, they're used to control and kill pests that may be harmful to society. Pesticides have many economical and agricultural benefits as well, like we've mentioned before. And who uses pesticides? Usually many farmers or agricultural companies use pesticides on their crops and plant products. Homeowners may also use certain pesticide products to eliminate unwanted organisms on their property, like rodents or fungi. Now, how are we going to be classifying pesticides? What determines what type of pesticide is what? First, pesticides are classified by their target organisms or type. The ones that I have up here are the 6 most common type of pesticides. There are insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, rodenticides, larvicides, and bactericides. These are the most popular, but there are a large variety of types of pesticides that have different target organisms. Then, from here, these types of pesticides are split up based on their origin, whether they are organic or synthetic. Following that, the classification of pesticides is based on their chemical structure and what chemical compounds are used to make up that pesticide. Oftentimes, organic pesticides are plant-based or based off of natural plants. Sometimes they're even based off of organic compounds like pyrethrin. On the other hand, synthetic pesticides are based off of more chemical-based substances like organochlorines, carbamates, or organophosphates. As mentioned previously, different types of pesticides are referred to by the type of pest that they control or kill. As an example, insecticides are a very common type of pesticide that kill, harm, or repel insects, ticks, and mites. Insecticides are composed of various chemicals that disrupt the nervous system of an insect to prevent them from engaging in cognitive behaviors, which eventually leads them to their death. They are used in various forms such as sprays, dusts, gels, and bits depending on the situation where they're needed. Some examples are insect repellent, garden sprays, and orchard sprays. Here's a short video to help better visualize the function of insecticides.
Small pores and spiracles allow some of the harmful material to enter his system. For the insecticide, entering Joey's system is just the beginning. It has the potential to kill him in an instant, thanks to lethal compounds like pyrethrins and pyrethoids. To understand why these compounds are toxic to Joey, you need to understand how neurons normally function. Suppose Joey's brain asks his legs to start scurrying around in order to freak out some humans. This message would travel as an impulse of positive ions from his brain to the legs via axons in the many neurons along the path. As the ions move through the axons, their charge gradually weakens, and this is not good because this means the message from the brain won't reach Joey's legs. If the message never arrives, he can't scurry around. To overcome this problem, there are voltage-gated sodium channels along the membrane that can allow positive ions or sodium ions to enter and maintain the strength of the impulse. Since they are voltage-gated, they open like doors in the presence of ions around them. In this case, when a weakened impulse reaches such a channel, they are triggered to open, allowing positive ions to enter and subsequently increase the impulse strength back to its original condition. This allows the impulse to maintain strength until it reaches its intended destination. That's how it normally should function. But when exposed to an insecticide after it breaches the imperfect armor, the harmful compounds will disrupt this critical system. What exactly do these compounds mess with? The doors. These compounds prevent the sodium channels from closing. They keep the doors open, which means the sodium ions keep entering through the membrane and it becomes depolarized. Since the axon is depolarized, the nerve impulses cannot propagate, and hence the brain cannot tell the rest of the body to do anything.
I will later go into more detail about some of the chemicals that are involved in many of these mechanisms. Although for now, this video has done an incredible job explaining and showing the functioning of insecticides. Another very common type of pesticide is herbicides. Herbicides kill or control weeds or unwanted plants so that crops and desired plants can grow and flourish. They often get absorbed by the plant from the roots in the soil and travel through the plant's vessels. There are 4 types of herbicides, which include auxins, enzyme blockers, photosynthetic inhibitors, and pigment inhibitors. The most common type of herbicide is a very general type, but it's weed killers. Some more specific products include Butril, Bladex, and Carapol, which are similar products produced by different herbicide-producing companies. Now, here's a short video to help better visualize the function of herbicides.
In this video, we will cover 5 groups of herbicides. Those are auxins, enzyme blockers, photosynthetic inhibitors, amino acids, and cell growth inhibitors. Growth regulators are commonly referred to as synthetic auxins. These chemicals mimic natural plant hormones and interrupt plant cell growth in newly forming stems and leaves. They affect protein production and normal cell division, leading to malformed growth. Synthetic auxins also kill plants by causing the cells in the tissue that carry water and nutrients to divide and grow without stopping. This is often called growing itself to death, which is seen by one side of the stem being longer than the other. Sulfonylurea, phenylpyrrolazine, and imidazolinone are examples of ALS inhibitors or enzyme blockers. They are chemicals that block the normal function of an enzyme called acetylactate synthase, or ALS. This enzyme is essential in amino acid or protein synthesis. Without proteins, plants starve to death. Enzyme blockers kill a wide range of plants, including broadleaf weeds, nutsedges, and grasses. ACCase inhibitors mainly kill grasses. This enzyme helps the formation of lipids or fats in the roots of grass plants. Without lipids, susceptible weeds die. Photosynthetic inhibitors such as bipyridinium and triazines are chemicals that interfere with photosynthesis, a plant's natural ability to make food, and disrupt plant growth, ultimately leading to death. There are also amino acid synthesis inhibitors, shoot and root growth inhibitors, and PPO inhibitors. Several herbicides fall into these groups, including glyphosate, acetochlor, and trifluralin. These herbicides stop or interrupt cell growth and division. Pigment inhibitors or bleachers are herbicides that cause the tissue of a plant to turn white after treatment. Examples include oxazolidinone, isoxazole, and trichotone. They interrupt the chlorophyll production in the plant, turning the plant tissue white and interrupting photosynthesis. The photosynthesis system can easily be damaged by sunlight without carotenoids.
This video has also done an incredible job explaining the 5 groups of herbicides. I will go into more detail about these later, although this video provides you with a very good general understanding of what herbicides are. Now, I'm going to be talking about some other less common types of pesticides. The first one is fungicides. Fungicides kill and prevent growth of mold, mildew, and various types of fungi. Most fungicides are absorbed by the fungi's cuticle, which is the outer surface, and damage the cell membranes, inactivating important enzymes and proteins which help them survive. Some examples of common fungicides include mancozeb, manab, and conazoles, which are very similar structurally, but have slightly different functions for different types of fungi pests. Rodenticides are another type of pesticide that kill unwanted rodents like mice and rats as a poison. Many rodenticides interfere with the activation of vitamin K in rodents. Vitamin K is an essential component in the production of blood clotting factors for rodents. Without blood clotting, rodents experience excessive bleeding and eventually die. They're often in the forms of pellets or in a poison trapper with baits like cheese or peanut butter. Some examples of rodenticides are Melsin rat bait stations, warfarin 1080, and bromethylene. Another less common type of pesticide is larvicides. Larvicides control mosquitoes by killing them in their larvae stage, which is their younger stage. Many larvicides are similar to insecticides in the way that they interfere with nerve signals. Their chemicals bind to enzymes which regulate nerve impulses and disrupt its functioning of signals passing through synapses. This causes nerves to signal each other without stopping, which disallows mosquitoes to breathe and perform other functions, until they eventually die. Some common examples of larvicides are Bacillus sphaericus, methoprene, and temephos. The final type of pesticide that I'm going to be talking about today are bactericides. Bactericides kill and prevent the formation of bacteria. These attack bacteria by damaging cell walls, lipids, enzymes, or proteins within the cell. This disallows bacteria to perform its functions that they need to survive. Some relatively common examples of bactericides are cephalosporins, monobactums, and vancomycins. As you can see at the bottom middle of the page, you see an image of what a regular bacteria looks like. And then the image on the right is a picture of what a bacteria looks like after monobactams have acted on it. You could see that its structure and shape have kind of deteriorated, as it doesn't have the proper functioning to survive. Alright, moving on to this pie chart. In this pie chart, we can see which types of pesticides are more common than others. As I mentioned above, herbicides and insecticides are the 2 most common types of pesticides, followed by fungicides, and then you can see that only 5.5% of pesticides are the other ones that I expressed, and then many more that I have not talked about. Herbicides and insecticides are the main pesticides that are used in agriculture, and this kind of explains why they are so greatly used and take up most of this pie chart. Well, that's because agriculture is the main use of pesticides globally. Now, to dive a little bit deeper into how these pesticides actually work and what's actually going on, I've selected the most common chemical that is used in these pesticides to explain their function and why they're used. So first, insecticides. DDT, or dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane, is a very common chemical that is used in insecticides. It interferes with the normal nerve impulses of insects by binding to acetylcholine receptors on the sodium ion channels, stimulating nerve impulses, which eventually leads to paralysis and eventually death. This mechanism was displayed in the video that I showed earlier about insecticides, although they didn't really go deep into what chemical is actually binding to the acetylcholine receptors, and in most cases, it is DDT. Next, herbicides. A very common chemical in herbicides is 2,4-D, which is otherwise known as 2,4-dichlorophenoliacetic acid. This causes the cells and tissues that carry water and nutrients to divide and grow without stopping. This is done by increasing plasticity of cell walls, amounts of proteins being made, and ethylene production in the stem cells. These alterations in chemical processes do not really allow plants to carry out their normal functions, which eventually kills it. For fungicides, copper ions are actually commonly used to disturb normal processes in the fungal cells. They disrupt cell metabolism by displacing other ions or binding to proteins, enzymes, and DNA in fungal cells. Fungal metabolism also allows fungi to break down organic matter and use it as energy to live. Improper metabolic processes eventually lead to the fungi dying along with their spores, which they use to reproduce. Without being able to reproduce, fungi eventually die, and that's how fungicides actually work. For rodenticides, a common chemical that is used is warfarin, as it binds to the enzyme vitamin K2,3 epoxide reductase and interrupts cellular recycling of vitamin K in the rodent's body. Without proper recycling of vitamin K, blood clotting factors in the rodents are inhibited, causing the rodent to experience excessive bleeding and eventually die. In larvicides, malathion is a very common chemical that binds to acetylcholine enzymes in the larvae and prevents chemical signals from transporting through synapses in between neural cells. Synapses are the spaces in between neural cells where the nerve signals are supposed to pass through. Although, malathion binding to the enzymes creates a blockage at the synapses. This prevents the neural signals from traveling through the larvae. It not being able to send neural signals eventually leads to its death. BTI, or Bacillus thuringiensis subspecies israelensis, is a very common naturally occurring substance that is used as a larvicide. It is often put into soil or water for larvae to eventually consume. It is only effective against actively feeding larvae, which is why it will not be effective on full-grown mosquitoes. After it is consumed, the BTI travels through the alkane environment of the larvae's digestive system. It gets dissolved and is converted into toxic protein molecules that cause pores to form in the walls of the insect's stomach. This sends a signal to the larvae's body to stop eating until it eventually passes away due to lacking essential nutrients from food. An image of what BTI generally looks like is shown in the bottom right corner of the slide. As you can see, these are more spherical, pill-looking substances. And finally, for bactericides, chlorine dioxide is a very common compound that reacts directly with disulfide bonds in amino acids and RNA in the bacteria cells. These disulfide bonds provide stability for the proteins. When they're broken to react with the chlorine dioxide, essential proteins in bacteria are disrupted, and they're not really able to synthesize. Bacteria use proteins to maintain their structure as enzymes for chemical processes and to transport nutrients throughout their cells. Without proteins, bacteria aren't really able to sustain themselves, and they eventually die off. Another way to classify pesticides is by determining whether they are synthetic or organic pesticides. Synthetic pesticides are formulated or manufactured by a chemical process that changes the substance that's extracted from a natural source. Some of their pros are it's easily accessible and readily available, and it's relatively cost-effective. Some cons for synthetic pesticides is that it's more hazardous generally for humans and for the environment as well. Pests also may develop a tolerance to these type of chemicals over time. Some examples are boric acid, DDT, and acephate. Now, organic or natural pesticides. These are derived from naturally occurring sources like minerals, plants, or animals, and undergo little to no chemical alterations. Some of their pros is that they work better long term. Pests can really develop less resistance to these because they're organic. These also have less harmful effects on bodily health of humans, animals, and also have less impact on the environment in general. This is also partially due to the fact that they are biodegradable and have no hazardous residue that is left on land or water. Although there are still some cons to these organic or natural pesticides. They can be expensive and are generally less easily accessible, and they also may require more knowledge about the chemicals to be used. Some examples of these are pyrethrin and rotenone. Most pesticides that we use are synthetic, as there are only really 28 different types of organic pesticides and thousands of synthetic pesticides. There's also various types of synthetic and organic pesticides which are used on different pests. The final way to classify pesticides is on their chemical composition. These are the four main types of pesticide-related chemicals that are commonly used. The first one is organophosphate, or OPE. These are mainly used in synthetic insecticides. They are part of phosphate ester groups, produced in the process of the acidification between phosphoric acid and alcohol. These phosphate ester compounds are not very polar and therefore they're less soluble in water because their intermolecular attractions are less than they would be with the intermolecular attractions between these molecules and water. Therefore, they also have a lower boiling point because it takes less heat energy to break these bonds apart because these bonds are not as strong due to the lower polarity and lower difference in electronegativity between majority of these bonds. As seen in these chemical structures, there are no hydrogen bonds because there are only phosphate, carbon, and oxygen atoms. For strong hydrogen bonds to occur within these molecules, there must be a hydrogen atom bonded to either fluorine, oxygen, or nitrogen. There are no hydrogen atoms in this molecule, therefore there are no hydrogen bonds. Organophosphates are very interesting molecules. When insects are exposed to them, they disturb the nerve signals in the insect's body. These signals are normally sent as electrical signals jumping through synapses from one nerve cell to another. However, organophosphate prevents these nerve cells from being able to pass through these synapses, preventing signals from properly traveling through the insects. This inhibits the nerve cell impulses and eventually leads to the insect's death. Some common examples are melitharin and pyrethrin. The next main type of chemical that is used in common pesticides are carbamates. Carbamates are very similar to organophosphates. They are also commonly used in synthetic insecticides, although they're part of the carbonate ester group, which are derived from carbamic acids. Carbamates affect the nervous system of insects by preventing the breakdown of acetylcholine enzymes, which then accumulate in synapses. This causes nerve signals to not properly send throughout the insect. They cannot perform proper bodily functions and eventually die. They're also very similar to organophosphates in the way that they function, besides the fact that these effects are actually reversible, as these chemical reactions are able to be reversed. Therefore, these effects do not last as long, and they're actually less toxic than organophosphates. Some examples of carbamates are aldecarb and oxyamyl. Here is actually a diagram that visually expresses the mechanisms of organophosphates and carbamates at the synapses between nerve cells. The green shapes are the acetylcholine receptors, where the black squares are actually the acetylcholine enzymes or the acetylcholine neurotransmitters. In the image on the left, they're able to bind pretty easily, and the signal, the blue squiggly line, is actually able to be seen. Signal passes through, the insect is able to function. Although, with the image on the right, you could see the yellow stars, which are actually the organophosphate pesticides or chemicals, which are preventing the binding with the acetylcholine neurotransmitters to the acetylcholine receptors. It prevents the breakdown of the acetylcholine and stops the signals from being passed through the insect. Another chemical group that is commonly used in many pesticides are organochlorines, or OCP. These are also commonly used in synthetic insecticides. They are part of chlorinated hydrocarbon groups, which are typically denser than many other compounds like water, due to them having chlorine atoms which have high atomic mass. Organochlorines are also allocating agents, which work by adding an alkyl group to a guanine base of the DNA molecules in cells. These prevent the strands of the double helix from linking as they should. This causes a breakage of DNA strands, affecting the ability of many cells to multiply. This is what occurs on a subatomic level in many insecticides. On a greater scale, this affects the nervous system by keeping the sodium ion channel in the nerve cells open. This causes the nerve impulses to fire spontaneously. These uncontrollable firings of nerve impulses cause the insect to go into a spasm and eventually die. Organochlorines are a group of chemicals that have extremely strong bonds between their chlorine and carbon components. These strong bonds make them highly insoluble in water, meaning they don't dissolve very well. When it rains, they spread widely through runoff. Runoff is a component of the environmental impact of pesticides, which will be discussed later. Once organochlorine pesticides are used, they stay around for a long time and spread in the soil. This affects many insects in a given area. They can also spread to groundwater and can contaminate human food and water. Because of this, they're not as commonly used now. Some examples are DDT and benzene hexachloride. Another very common chemical that is found in many pesticides is pyrethrin. These are often found in organic insecticides and are derived from natural chrysanthemum flowers and are composed of an acid and an alcohol. Similarly to organochlorines, they interact with voltage-gated sodium channels in neurons by binding to acetylcholine neurotransmitters on the gates of the channels. This results in the depolarization of nerve cells, which is also caused by the prolonged influx of sodium ions. This means that many positive sodium ions are flowing into the nerve cells, giving it an overall positive charge. Nerve cells aren't used to this and they don't really know how to counteract. Therefore, the nerve impulses in the insect's body are stimulated, which eventually leads to paralysis of the insects and often results in death. Pyrethrins also have a highly nonpolar nature, with only having CO, CH, and CC dipole-dipole bonds. These are relatively weak compared to very strong hydrogen bonds in other molecules. They also have a high affinity for soil and sediment particulate matter, causing them to have low mobility in the soil. These are often used as they are less likely to get into groundwater and do not contaminate drinking water supplies. Pyrethrins are much safer to use than other chemicals overall. Some examples include alethrin, resomethrin, and permethrin. Here is a diagram that visually expresses the mechanisms of organochlorines and pyrethrins at the sodium ion channels. So, as you can see on the left of this image, the sodium ion channels, with Na labeled next to it, are kind of like doors that open and close, allowing sodium ions to enter the neural cells, which travel around with the nerve impulses, indicating to the nerve cells when to send the signals. Although, pyrethrins and organochlorines keep these doors open, allowing many sodium ions to flow through. This stimulates the nerve impulses, which overwhelms the insects and eventually leads to their death. You can also see the disruptive mechanisms of OPs and carbamates in the right side of the image, which was discussed earlier. All of these functional groups have slightly unique purposes, although they're all used in pesticides for the same main reason of eliminating pests. Now, moving on to the next part of my presentation. How do pesticides impact humans and the environment? Now, let's begin with speaking about the common health risks of pesticides. There are many acute or short-term health risks and also some chronic or long-term health risks. Many of these health risks are included on the screen, although I'm not going to be reading through them due to time constraints. Although, an important thing to note is that the term pesticide poisoning relates to many of these acute or short-term health risks. These are fairly common for any type of pesticide exposure, whereas the long-term health risks are not as common, but they do still appear in populations. Next, I will be talking about the impact that pesticides have on the environment. Pesticides can have various harmful effects on any type of environment, especially if the pesticides move outside of the intended site. The cases of this include adsorption, volatilization, spray drift, runoff, and leaching. Adsorption is the binding of pesticides to soil particles, particularly to soils in high concentrations of clay or organic matter. Volatilization is the process of solids or liquids converting into a gas, which then leads to vapor drift, which is the movement away from the initial application site. This can damage nearby crops, ecosystems, or even wildlife. Spray drift is the next case that particles are able to move outside of the intended site. This is the airborne movement of spray droplets. It can damage nearby crops and can be also hazardous to people. It greatly affects insects and many animals and wildlife as well. It can contaminate water in ponds, streams, and also harm fish. The next case is runoff. This is the movement of pesticides in water over a sloping surface. This can pollute lakes, streams, ponds, and wells. It's shown in the image on the slide. As you can see, there's a little bit of a slope in the soil platform. Particles travel down the slope into other untargeted places. The final case is leaching, which is the movement of pesticides in water through the soil. This can affect the groundwater. Overall, pesticide contamination can spread in various ways and can easily affect non-targeted species. This can contribute to pesticides' impact on the overall environment. Oftentimes, the end consumer of pesticides are non-target species, which can die in large quantities, altering the natural food web, which takes ecosystems out of their equilibrium. With populations changing within an ecosystem, predators and prey may not be able to balance and more life can begin to die. Humans do our best to eliminate all of these possibilities by isolating farms with crops and pesticides, although sometimes we're often not successful and habitats can continue to suffer because of pesticide exposure. Here is an example of a food web where pesticides are introduced into the ecosystem. It is seen that pesticides impact crops and insects, from herbicides and insecticides respectively. These contaminated crops and bugs are consumed by farm animals, mammals, and birds. This exposes a large part of the animal kingdom to many chemicals and pesticides that could harm them. Some pesticides that are used in crops also eventually lead back to us humans, which can cause the serious health problems that were discussed above. Overall, the food web is impacted by pesticides in many negative ways. Now moving on to the third section of my presentation, the global impact of pesticides. An interesting fact is that the top 10 pesticide-consuming countries in the world are China, US, Argentina, Thailand, Brazil, Italy, France, Canada, Japan, and India. Although these countries have all reduced their pesticide usage in the past few years and continue to do so. Some countries have put laws into place banning certain pesticides and have also found some greener alternatives and have worked together to fix the pesticide issue. However, this process has been very slow. A global organization that's committed to helping the pesticide issue is the Pesticide Action Network, or PAN. They currently have listed 338 highly hazardous pesticides that are still being used globally. Some countries are also behind than others in reducing their pesticide usage. Unfortunately, many pesticides that are banned in other countries are still being used in the US. Specifically, there are 72 different pesticides that are banned in European countries that are still used in the United States. It is seen that every country is working at their own pace and taking different actions to try to reduce the negative impact of pesticides. Each country actually has their own list of pesticides that are banned, and in total, there are over 460 active pesticides ingredients that have been banned throughout the world. Now, there are 3 examples of countries that have really reduced their pesticide usage significantly in the past 2 years: Brazil, India, and Indonesia. Brazil actually has a natural program for inputs of organic agriculture, which was launched to stimulate the use of less toxic and natural technologies or substances. India has proposed their pesticide management bill, which is a law that was set up by the Central Pesticide Board to advise the government on pesticides. Finally, the Indonesian government has labeled hazardous and toxic substances not able to be used or manufactured without submitting an application. This is huge and has significantly decreased their pesticide use in the past few years. Here is an interesting map of the world that displays countries that have high usage of pesticides with darker colors and countries that have less pesticide usage with lighter colors. It's very interesting to see where the majority of pesticides are used. From what I could tell, there are a lot of pesticides being used in North and South America and also a lot in China. I can also see that majority of Africa does not really consume many pesticides. It is also important to note that pesticide use in developing countries often takes years to approve new pesticides. Therefore, older and cheaper and probably more harmful pesticides are more likely to be available for their users. Developing countries also lack resources to enforce legislation on pesticide use, so they're more limited on what they can do to contributing to finding greener alternatives to pesticides. Overall, many nations around the world are working together to find solutions and reduce the negative impact of pesticides on our society and the environment. Although this is a very slow process because of how integrated pesticides are into our society. Although there are still many organizations that are working hard to speed up this process. There are over hundreds of organizations, although these are probably 4 of the most major organizations that I found. OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It has 38 member countries that work together to evaluate the risks of individual pesticides more quickly, and they share progress in risk reduction and alternatives. Governments cooperate in assessing and reducing the risks of agricultural pesticides and sustainably managing pests. Another organization is FAO, which is the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. This is the specialized agency of the UN that has set sustainable development goals and advocate for the use of more natural and less harmful pesticides in food. Another large organization is the EPA, which is the Environmental Protection Agency. This organization is a large contributor to the regulations and protection of human health and the environment from harmful pesticides. And finally, the last organization is the PAN, the Pesticide Action Network, which is what I mentioned before. This is an international organization that investigates issues and takes action concerning pesticide use around the globe. Some of their current campaigns are Fair Harvest for farm workers and their families who are affected by pesticides in their working environment. Stop Pesticide Drift, which its impacts on the environment outside of non-targeted species in the area. Finally, Saving the Bees, who are greatly affected by pesticides overall. Some species are even coming close to being extinct due to the use of insecticides. As mentioned earlier, some countries and global organizations are leaning towards greener alternatives and trying their best to reduce the negative impact of pesticides. Here are 4 very common greener alternatives that we're trying to lean towards. The first one is increased use of integrated pest management, or IPM. This is sort of a mechanism of using more natural and organic pesticides as opposed to synthetic or chemical pesticides. IPM is a sustainable, science-based approach to pest management. This involves the prevention by planning and managing ecosystems, identification of pests as well as beneficial organisms, monitoring, taking action, and evaluating pesticide use around the world. The next greener alternative is using more agronomic practices. These practices involve appropriate plant and soil fertility management, crop rotation seasonally, appropriate irrigation management, and appropriate timing and location of planting to reduce pests. Another practice that's involved is agroecology. This is the reinforcement interaction of pests and natural enemies to maintain a natural balance in the ecosystem. So rather than using pesticides to eliminate insects that might be on crop fields, one may use a predator that preys on many of these insects. Another greener alternative to pesticides is using more natural pesticides or biocontrol. Instead of using highly hazardous pesticides, which have more severe harmful effects on society and the environment, the use of biopesticides may severely decrease the negative impact of pesticides in general. And the final greener alternative to pesticides is by strengthening global policies on sustainable and safe pesticide use. Enforcing legislation on pesticide distribution and methods of using pesticides is a great way to limit the negative impact that they have on our society. So you may be wondering, why haven't we completely got rid of pesticides? Why haven't we completely made the change to more greener alternatives? Well, there are many reasons, and they're listed on this slide. New pesticide products are difficult and expensive to produce. By many companies, they don't really want to spend all this money on organic pesticides. They also would not be able to profit as much. Some companies may favor profits over safety and proper use of pesticides. They may not be profiting off these greener alternatives because the world is already used to having these pesticides. Everyone's already used to using these harmful pesticides. It's very challenging to veer away from them if they're already so popular in agriculture and people's homes around the world. Developing countries also lack many resources to enforce legislation on pesticide use. It may be difficult for many of these developing countries to obtain these greener alternatives. Nearing the end of the presentation, I had a few concluding thoughts and ideas that I wanted to bring up. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, there are many pros and cons to pesticides. I kind of wanted to summarize these in a little table. So, many of the pros of pesticides. They increase crop production. They kill unwanted pests that carry disease or take up space in fields. They lower the cost of food. They reduce global hunger. They're also effective and fast-acting method of removing pests in many fields and crops. Agricultural economy is also more profitable with the use of pesticides. Although we've also discovered that there are many negative aspects of pesticides as well. They accumulate in the food chain and spread throughout ecosystems, impacting wildlife and the environment. Adverse health effects to people and wildlife. Pesticides can even kill people or non-target species. They spread through soil and increase groundwater pollution. Pests also develop resistance to the pesticides over time, so in the future they may not be as effective. Overall, I hope that you've really learned a lot about pesticides and the pros and cons that they bring to our society. Going back to the question that I asked earlier in this presentation, do you think that the pros of pesticides really outweigh the cons? After listening to all this, are pesticides really beneficial for our society? Or should everyone contribute to put an end to pesticides? Given the food demand and requirements in our world, is it even possible to end the use of pesticides? Or perhaps maybe transitions to greener solutions like I mentioned above, maybe that might be a better solution. Overall, thank you very much for listening to my presentation. If you made it to the end, congratulations. I apologize that this is a pretty lengthy presentation. Thank you very much for your time and have a great day.